Grace and peace. Welcome to Judah's Roar Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Apostle Cheryl. Before we get started, take a few seconds, check down here. Check. Down here, below the box, it's down there somewhere. Yeah, check down there, below the video, and click the subscribe button. And then make sure you click the bell so that you receive a notification every time we upload a new video on Sunday evenings at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And when you have a few extra minutes, check out our animations as well. Feel free to share any of our videos on all of your social media platforms. That's one way that you can partner with us in our quest to end domestic violence. All right, let's get to it. So last week we talked about proximity and domestic violence. And we're going to do a continuation of part 2 of that because I in thinking about this and preparing for this, I thought about how many different ways the proximity kind of shows up in an abusive relationship that we may not really be sensitive to initially. All right. So proximity, by definition, is the quality or state of being proximate, closeness, adjacency, nearness, immediacy. Proximity is the quality or state of being proximate, closeness, adjacency, nearness, immediacy. The opposite of proximity is distance or remoteness. Now, another definition for proximity is nearness in place, nearness in time, nearness in order, nearness in occurrence or relation, or closeness. So let's talk about emotional proximity. Emotional proximity, these are conclusions that I've arrived at just thinking about this. Emotional proximity has to do with that closeness, the adjacency, the emotional trauma bond that forms between an abuser and the victim or victims. And it's because our brain is rewired, literally rewired, physically rewired, and it even changes in volume when we're exposed to abuse. It's like the emotional proximity is what can keep us trapped and ensnared and connected from an emotional standpoint, even if we have physically left the relationship. And this is why it's so similar to an addiction, because this is why a victim can leave an abusive relationship and they can go on with their life and they can get a new job and they can get on their feet and have financial independence. And then they get a phone call or they get a text or they get contacted on social media by the abuser. And if they respond, if they connect emotionally, they're right back where they started from. And so that emotional proximity is kind of like this button that the abuser can push. And it really doesn't matter how long you've been away from that abusive relationship, unless you have truly, truly healed. They can trigger you really by just pressing that emotional proximity button. That's what I call it. So they will use the emotional proximity to pull you back. And typically, when that happens, it's because their current source of supply has tapped out or is insufficient or whatever. So they're always in search of supply. When the current partner is no longer producing the type of supply that they feel they're entitled to, then they'll reach back for whoever it's worked with in the past. Okay, so that's the emotional proximity. And the thing that makes it complicated for a victim is that it can be emotionally, it can feel excruciatingly painful, and like it can feel like a physical pain to try to resist the pull of the abuser when they reach back out to you. And it can be excruciatingly painful when the relationship is over, right? And they move on to more supply. It can be difficult to hear about a new relationship. And it can be difficult to hear about a relationship in which that person, at least on the surface, appears to be getting everything that you were not able to get from this person who said that they loved you and cared about you. And so that's emotional proximity. And that's an ongoing healing that has to occur. And it takes a lot of work, but I'm telling you, it's absolutely possible to heal to a place where there is zero interest in the abuser when they reach out. There's no there's no emotional thing for you to overcome. There's no, and that comes in time. That comes in time where you feel nothing really. Okay, when they reach out, you don't respond. You don't feel obligated to respond. You don't think you need to acknowledge that they, that they've spoken to you or sent you a message or whatever. You just ignore them. Okay. And so that's when you know that healing is really taking place from an emotional standpoint. Now, financial proximity can really complicate things. And so when I think about financial proximity, when I think about financial closeness or financial adjacency, things like a joint bank account, which on the surface seems like a great idea, right? If you're trying to build a life with someone and you've got these shared goals, supposedly, and you want the same things, you want to build a future together, then you join things together. Okay, so a joint bank account is one way that an abuser can utilize financial proximity um, in a controlling manner. Um, Health insurance through the abuser's employment, because that's totally in their control, right? They can go to human resources and decide that they don't want the family plan. They just want to be covered themselves. And it's totally up to them. And you may not even be aware that that has occurred. So that's another way. If the victim is unemployed or underemployed, the victim maybe is working part time and therefore doesn't get any health benefits and therefore doesn't get, a lot of the other perks that full time employees get. So that's another way that financial proximity can be impactful. The abuser's intimate knowledge of the victim's financial status, how much income they have, when it comes, where it comes from. So, them being able to keep their finger on the pulse of the victim's finances helps them to continually orchestrate their coercive control tactics. Okay. The abuser may confiscate and control household finances. Check this out, even if they don't work. Hmm? Even if they don't work, they may control the victim's finances. I mean, literally have it deposited in their own account. Literally, the victim may have to get an allowance. And typically, if that occurs, of course, it's financial abuse. But invariably, they don't get enough to take them very far, which makes it necessary for them to repeatedly come to the abuser or wait until the abuser feels like it to get what they need. And it won't be enough when they do get it. Okay. So that's financial proximity. And those things, when you're talking about exiting a situation, you really have to put a lot of forethought into it so that you don't end up without access to your own money. Physical proximity is, I think, the more obvious of the three types that I've been talking about. When we talk about physical proximity, we're talking about things like stalking. We are talking about living in the same household. We're talking about maybe the abuser driving by the victim's place repeatedly or sitting outside the house to see who's coming and who's going. Um, it could be that there's been a domestic violence incident, and it could be that the victim was arrested, has been incarcerated, maybe is released on bond. And so, if that's the case, if there's no restraining order that's being honored, no order of protection that's being honored, then the victim could be set up. The abuser could make a call to the police and say, okay, I'm afraid of this person, and they're out on bail right now, but they said this or they did that or whatever. And so then that being constricted by a court order for a victim really can strengthen the abuser's hand, and that they can use it against them. They can lie and make up things, and before you know it, the victim's incarcerated again. If the victim is charged and is sentenced, and let's say they have house arrest, um, the abuser may try to entice them to leave the house. If there's no protective order in place, then they're forced to stay there with the abuser. We've all been experiencing this pandemic over the past couple of years, and so we understand that oftentimes the victim is trapped in the house with the abuser because everything has been shut down, or maybe they've lost employment, and so proximity can be forced in that regard. Another way that proximity can be forced is poor, horrific spiritual guidance based on misappropriated scriptures. Y'all know how I feel about that. Where people are encouraged, admonished, even ordered to stay in an abusive situation so as not to break up the family unit, which is really not a family unit anyway, because everybody's being tormented behind that closed door. And so when appearance is more important than actual health, safety, and welfare of the people that are being victimized, that is a problem. And oftentimes in times past, people have been advised to remain and to stay and to endure and to have faith and to pray more and to fast and to meditate and to do all these things, which makes them the problem. And it makes them solely responsible for fixing the problem, when the actual problem is that the abuser is abusive because they can be. Okay. So when our legal system forces a victim to stay in a situation, or if a victim is concerned about losing their children because of some lies or whatever that the abuser may tell, or if they're concerned about being sent off to jail, being arrested because the abuser lies and says that the victim's done something that they haven't done. This forces proximity. It forces the victim to stay in a situation that is decidedly dangerous. And so this is why, whenever possible, certainly if there are no children involved, no contact is the best way to escape abuse once you are out, so that you don't feed into the emotional proximity, so that you don't feed into and reestablish physical proximity, and so that you don't reinstitute the financial proximity. And so when we have proximity to someone who is determined to control and determined to maintain that control, proximity on those levels, the emotional proximity, continuing to talk to them, continuing to meet with them. And please don't do this. Don't go back to get your things. Don't go back to get closure, because oftentimes victims are murdered when they do that. And the abuser cannot harm you physically directly unless they have physical proximity of you. Now, the emotional proximity oftentimes can lead to physical proximity. The financial proximity can lead to physical proximity. Okay. And so you don't want to be connected at all, if at all possible. Now, sometimes it's not possible to avoid that because you have children or whatever. But I admonish you, in those instances where there are no children and you don't have a pet, or, please, 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 proximity is like the potting soil for an abusive relationship. Proximity, whether it be physical, emotional, or financial. And remember that if you have the financial proximity, then they still have control of your finances and your ability to rebuild your life. The emotional proximity will undermine the fact that there's no physical proximity, right? The upsurge that we've seen over the past 10, 12, 15 years or so in relationships that begin online really is proof that it's possible to become emotionally entangled and not occupy the same physical space, okay? So remember that emotional proximity leaves the door open for renewed physical proximity and renewed financial proximity. Financial proximity has the power to force you into physical proximity just so that you can access finances, so that you can live, okay? So we've been talking about the different types of proximity as they relate to domestic violence. This is Apostle Cheryl with Judas Ward Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative. I want you to know that there is life after abuse. I am a living witness. There is life after abuse, and you can have a happy, full, satisfying life after abuse, but you have to do the work. You have to do the work. Resist the urge to isolate. Resist the urge to isolate. Resist the urge to isolate. Maintain contact with other humans who are not being mean and nasty to you. Continue to educate yourself about domestic violence. There are many, many resources out here, domesticshelters.org, our own YouTube channel, Judas Roar Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative. Stand Up Survivor is another one. There are many, many resources out here. You're not alone, okay? We are pulling for you. We're pulling for you. You stay safe out there. Blessings to you.